Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. So how you doing? I don't believe you. It's a long, nice 3-day, 4-day weekend. I don't know what it was for people. So we had a nice time, nice weather and everything. But that's over now. Back to work. So, what I want to talk about today is sort of continuing this discussion of personality psychology. And it's kind of a historical treatment over the next couple of days. So we talked about Freud for 2 days to really kind of give you the basics of his theory. And it really only touches on the real sort of core aspects of it. Freud was incredibly productive and interesting thinker, and it's nice to have that again, because when you sort of that in a sense, that's when personality psychology, certainly in its modern form, started, and then much of the rest of it is kind of a reaction to Freud in various ways. Today what I want to talk about is the people who sort of reacted to it most directly, particularly his sort of some of his early disciples who really sort of embraced the basic psychoanalytic ideas like Jung and Adler and Horney and Erik Erikson, and then a more sort of significant departure in the humanistic approaches of Maslow and Carl Rogers. And then next time we're going to talk about some of the real modern personality work, which is much more research-based, etc. So, and I'll finish the story here. So let me just remind you, right, that we have an exam next Thursday. And so it's going to be very much like before, right? 64 multiple choice questions, covers the lectures, materials, and readings. Again, this is something I've never done before. I want to make sure everybody understands. So it's going to cover up till this Thursday is all. So I'm going to talk on Tuesday, but that will be covered on the next exam. So normally I would give the exam on Tuesday, but we have a conference coming up where we're all going to be gone on Thursday, so it's a good time to give an exam. I can't be here anyway, and so I just switched it around. So we'll do some introductory work on the last part of the course on Tuesday, but the material that's covered on the exam just goes through next time, next Thursday. Right? What's nice is that you'll have a study guide, you'll have that for a little longer, a full week and everything, and you can get ready with that material. And et cetera, you know the rest. Any questions about that? Okay. Get fired up. Oh, my back hurts. So, Freud had a habit throughout his life of forming really intense bonds with people, intellectual bonds. He had several early mentors that he attached to. As soon, not long after, his prominence sort of grew through the end of the 19th century, and then flowered with the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. And soon after that, he started to attract followers. So his ideas were unusual and attractive to a lot of people, and he started to have people gather around him. Originally, they met on Wednesday afternoons at his house. So every Wednesday they would gather to talk about psychoanalytic ideas. It was originally called the Wednesday Club, and then eventually, as it grew larger and larger, it turned into what's usually called the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. So they developed their own journal, and they had meetings, and had officers, and presidents, and a vice president, and secretary, and all that kind of stuff. And many of these people, again, all of them began as devoted followers of Freud, and then slowly they tended to break away. That Freud didn't really allow a lot of dissent. Although he was really intellectually engaged with people and he took people's ideas very seriously, once people started to sort of drift away from him, then he tended to break up with them. And so they're often referred to as Neo-Freudians, or followers who broke with Freud in significant ways, but maintained some of the basic psychoanalytic orientation. And I want to talk just a little bit about some of their ideas and how they sort of broke from him. One of the more famous ones was a guy named Carl Jung. He wasn't one of the earliest members of the Wednesday Club or the Psychoanalytic Society. He first met Freud. Again, he was a Swiss physician who is really influenced by Freud, and met him, I think, in 1906 originally. And there's a great story that when they first met, they locked in conversation and essentially talked for 13 straight hours. First time that they met. And it was the beginning of a very intense bond that they had for about 6-7 years. Freud saw Jung as his sort of successor for a while. Kind of treated him like a son. Wanted to sort of give, in a sense, the field to him, but increasingly Jung's ideas started to diverge. Jung was a pretty interesting guy. He was very spiritual. He was raised, his father was a minister, he was raised in a sort of intensely religious house, and that kind of, those ideas flowed with him as he developed his own kind of, his own version of psychoanalytic psychology. He referred to as analytical psychology. He had some really, really interesting ideas. I'm not going to give a full treatment of Jung here at all, but just to kind of tag some ideas for you. One of them was this idea of the collective unconscious. So he believed that, so Freud, of course, believed that there was this deep reservoir of all these unconscious urges and impulses and things that every individual had, right? And Jung accepted that as well, but he also thought that there was what he called the collective unconscious. That wasn't just located in a single individual. It was sort of collectively connected everybody together. And what he really meant by that was that there was this kind of pool of shared common experiences. He thought that these guys were very influenced by Darwin. They saw these as evolutionarily ingrained sorts of notions, and Jung had this idea that there were these basic kind of what he called archetypes. Many of his ideas were very unusual. He was influenced by Plato's idea of the perfect forms, and so there were these kind of perfect forms of sort of human experience that were part of this collective unconscious. So things like the perfect mother, and the man and woman, and these really sort of fundamental sort of concepts that every human had to go through. And he saw them in literature, and he said, here's these things, these sort of commonly recurring things, and these things exist in this sort of collective unconscious. I just want to give you a little experience with him here. A little 2-minute, and that's Carl Jung, a little 2 minutes of him talking about stuff. So, explaining a little bit about his ideas of the archetypes. Let's play this for a second. Oops.
It is like a seizure. Yeah. So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, is that such a case? You see, you have a certain image in yourself without knowing it of the woman, of the real woman. Yeah. Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type. Yeah. And instantly you get a seizure and you're gone. Yeah. And afterwards you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. Or you see, a man is quite capable, he's intelligent enough to see that woman of his choice, as one says, no choice, he has been captured. Yeah. You know, he sees that she's no good at all, yeah. That she's a hell of a business. And he tells me so, and he says, for God's sake, Doctor, help me to get rid of that hell. He can't. He's like clay nothing. And that is the archetype. That is so what the archetype of the animal. Yeah. And he thinks it is all well, in our Dutch it's a bit complicated, you know. The animal is an archetype form expressing the fact that a man has a minority of feminine or female genes, yeah, and that is something that doesn't disappear in him, that is constantly present, and it works as a female in a man. Therefore, already in the 16th century, the humanists have discovered that man has an anima, at least. And that each man carries his female with himself, I say. Yeah.
Most of it seems like he just kind of babbles about stuff, right? Not much to remember too much. But so he's got this idea, for example, of the anima and the animus, these perfect forms of male and female, and that everybody has those in themselves, and they recognize them. He was the first to develop this idea of a complex too, which is that sort of something you're in a sense fixated on. You have a complex, you may have a Madonna complex or something where you're always this sort of perfect female form that's the virginal, perfect woman, you're the perfect mother figure versus the kind of the Madonna and the whore kind of idea that there's this other kind of form. And these things occur and seem to exist in this kind of ether of this collective unconscious. He's also, just to give you a little bit more of a flavor for this, right? He's also developed this idea of synchronicity, right? That there's some sort of acausal connection between things. That certain coincidences occur, and it expresses something real and powerful. There's this, but it's not causal in some sense. It's just that things are connected with the physical world in this weird way. This was, for example, Sting was really influenced by Carl Jung when and his album Synchronicities expresses a lot of Carl Jung's ideas. I don't know, other people, I was connecting these things into popular culture. There's a movie about, that's actually a really good movie about the relationship between Freud and Jung is called A Dangerous Method. If you ever used or ever saw the reruns of the series Frasier, they were both Jungian psychologists. And Jung also, again, was very spiritual, and he believed that everybody had this sort of fundamentally religious nature to them. And his ideas were these kind of weird spiritual ideas. And for example, he was often credited as being the first person to sort of, or the inspiration for Alcoholics Anonymous. Again, this idea that you can treat addiction with some sort of religious conviction, giving yourself up to this religious part of yourself. So very influential, very unusual. You hear him talk about at cocktail parties, so that's what I wanted to tell you about. Get out your clickers. Let's ask another question here. We're going to ask our first question. So which do you think is the most important goal people have in life? So I want you to really think about it. So what do you think drives people? Because this becomes kind of the central dispute very often in with the Neo-Freudians and Freud. So what really drives people? Do you think that people, sort of the fundamental drive in human nature is striving to satisfy basic biological needs, A. B, striving to feel as good and worthy as others, feel good about yourself. C, striving to feel safe and secure. Or D, striving to figure out who you are and what is your place in the world. So which of those do you think, if you really just place your bet on one of those is what you think is kind of the central goal, drive, the thing that's motivating people in life. Pick a card, any card, A, B, C, D. About 3 more seconds. Okay. So D, there's a clear winner here, right? So 54% and smattering of support for the others. So you guys feel like striving to figure out who they are and what is their place in the world, which is going to be interesting because you're probably right at that point in life, and that's exactly what's going on. So this, again, becomes kind of the central goal. So where Freud, most of the Neo-Freudians broke with Freud was with his really intense focus on instinctual gratification and sexual gratification in particular, right? This idea that Freud really thought that was the driving force. That's what people, was, if you wanted to know why people did the things they did, it was all under the surface, and peeled away the layers, that was the central issue, right? And it was really an id thing, right? He really saw the id as this sort of dominant driving force, where his followers tended to, what a common theme among them was they felt like he didn't give enough credit to sort of the here and now, the ego, the sort of more conscious part of yourself, and how people managed to deal with sort of everyday life events and the power that the ego had to either manage that well or manage that poorly. And as a group, they're often referred to as ego psychologists or ego psychology because of their emphasis on this. And they all had a slightly different take on it. One of Freud's earliest followers, right there at the beginning was a guy named Alfred Adler. And he was a physician like Freud. And he was one of the first to break away. That was, again, he was kind of Freud's first kind of chosen attachment in a lot of ways, successor. And he broke, again, on this same basis about ego psychology. His idea was, no, that is, if you really want to know what drives people, what people are striving for, again, isn't instinctual gratification. It's really this sense of superiority or mastery, right? He called it superiority, this idea of wanting to, what people want to do is be able to be superior over things and people, right? To be able to manage things, to deal with the things they had to deal with, to compare well to others, right? To have this kind of positive feeling. You can see these ideas kind of surface again in humanistic approach too. He was the first person to coin the term inferiority complex. Right, so he was what he said was many problems, psychological problems that people have, right, are really about feelings of inferiority. Now he talked about organ deficiencies, when people feel like they're not, strong enough or don't like the body type, or things, but it was broader than that. So all these things that people would say, gee, I don't feel good about myself. I feel inferior, and I'm trying to work that out. Again, all the Neo-Freudians accepted all the rest is sort of a psychodynamic orientation, right? They believed that the unconscious did a lot of work, that people have to use these defense mechanisms to try and compensate for things. So sometimes an inferiority complex really manifested itself as a superiority complex, right? So the idea that as you felt bad about some aspect of yourself, and those are the one catches this idea that these people were blowhards, I'm better than everybody else, so they're really working out. They're feeling inferior, and so they sort of manifest these signs of superiority, right? So that concept obviously is carried on, so most people in their common language understand the idea of an inferiority complex, and that goes back to Alfred Adler. A slightly different take, Karen Horney was one of the really first female psychoanalysts, along with Anna Freud and a few others, but she was a German physician, again, who, again, really partly reacted to Freud about his chauvinistic, male-oriented theory. So she really had a problem with things like penis envy, with things like the Oedipus complex. She didn't believe that Freud was giving adequate sort of representation or to women or characterizing them well. And so she began to break. That was her basic idea, the core notion that she said, no, people aren't striving for instinctual gratification, they're not striving for superiority. What they're striving for is security. What people want to feel is secure, safe, secure, taken care of, right? And that's what people do things and operate. If you want to know why people are sort of doing the things that they're doing, well, they're trying to get some sense of security, right? That has a certain amount of appeal. And she, for example, like I'm just giving the sort of core concepts of a lot of these things. She had this idea that there were sort of three ways that people sought security, in a sense. They either moved toward people, moved against people, or moved away from people. So again, if you're feeling insecure, you can move toward people, right? You can connect with people. That's the basis for our social relationships. Oh, I don't feel like I have everything I need. Well, I want to have friends and family. I want to have a spouse. I want to have these things. I want to connect with people, right? I want to move toward them. And again, each of these can have sort of a positive and a negative urge, right? So that's good, right? We see that this desire to sort of connect with people and maintain social relationships is such a central part of human existence. We've been talking about a lot in this class. But again, you can get too attached to people. Or you can use your sense of, gee, I've got to solve all my problems by attaching to you. And that's the partner that's needy. It seems to need you too much and too attached, right? So there's sort of a good version, a bad version. Moving against. So if you want to feel secure, you can move against people. If people, if you're afraid of people or somehow intimidated by them, you can move against them. You can be aggressive. Right? Now you can also, again, being assertive is good and finding your way and finding your own independence and all that. That's also kind of moving against people, but it can manifest itself also as sort of aggression. And then the idea of moving away from people. Then the other thing you do to get security is get away from people. You can isolate yourself. Now again, there's a good version of that where you're developing your own sense of competence and capability, right, by sort of getting away from people, your own individuality, but there's also sort of this isolationist and negative side of that, right? And so she talked about these kind of three different sorts of strategies that people use and how different psychological disorders can be traced to their desire to get the security by either moving toward, moving against, or moving away from people. Again, much more ego-oriented, much more kind of day-to-day. I'm just trying to make myself feel good and be connected, and the ways that, and a real emphasis on the way the ego manages all these sorts of threats. Finally, another one that's been very influential, and probably more influential in sort of a modern sense than maybe all the others, is Erikson. And Erikson, again, he was actually not a physician. He was trained as a psychologist. He came around a little bit later. And his whole idea, well, he took Freudian psychology and, again, accepted the basic tenets of it, but focused on this idea of identity, right? That what people are trying to do, as you guys voted for, right, is this idea that what people are trying to do is figure out who they are. They're trying to develop a sense of identity, of where they fit in the world, and that's the lifelong struggle that they have. Kind of, who am I? Right? And we all know in modern psychological problems, we all know about kind of identity and the search for identity and the striving to figure out who you are. You hear a lot about that. And what was interesting about Erikson is he developed his own stage theory. He had a theory very much like Freud's, where he said people move through these sets of invariant stages, and he even sort of adopted the beginning of Freud's sort of typology, right, the stages, but he saw them, again, not as this energy moving from one erogenous zone to another, but rather there were identity crises. There were things that had to get managed at each step, and there were a set of developmental steps that people went through. And he also broke from Freud in the sense of that he didn't believe that personality development ended in childhood, but it continued going, and there were more challenges and stages that you had to go through to sort of develop this identity notion all the way through life. So this is just a graphic that shows Erikson's stages along with Freud's stages. So here's the psychosocial stage, age, And then what Freud, how it corresponds, the first one is the Freud's stages. And again, at each stage there was sort of a psychosocial crisis. Okay, this idea of an identity crisis is Erickson's. Right, at each stage it's sort of a crisis that you have to manage. There's kind of two different ways that it can resolve itself. And then at each point you develop a skill or a virtue that comes out of those. If you manage that step well, and if you don't manage that step well, you don't get nearly as much of it, right? So again, where Freud saw the birth to 1 year as the oral stage, what Erickson focused on is there's a particular sort of psychosocial crisis of trust versus mistrust. This is the time when you're connected to this mother figure, and that can either go well or poorly, right? So you can get the things that you need from her, come to realize that people will give you the things that you need, and you can trust people, or you can sort of not get the things that you need, and you just develop a sense of trust. And so that was the first thing. Can I place trust in other people, right? And if you can, if that goes well, you sort of resolve that crisis on the side of trust, then you acquire this virtue of hope. Sort of optimism. Yes, people are good. I can connect with people. If I give myself to other people, I can trust them to do things. You can see how that goes in with weaning and all those sorts of issues. The second, where Freud saw the anal stage, Erickson saw this conflict between autonomy versus self-doubt. Again, it's that idea that Freud had about that feces is kind of the first product that kids make. It's like, here's this thing, I did this, wow, look at how good this is. And that's more generally in Erickson's idea. That's what little kids are trying to get a sense of, what can I do things? Now I have to start doing things for myself. Can I play? Can I build things? Can I produce things? Or am I the kind of, can I not do it? Do I have that confidence and that sense of my own autonomy and independence, or do I have doubts about myself? And again, the acquired skill there is will, this idea of kind of saying, yes, I can do things, and I can be an autonomous initiating agent in the world. At the phallic stage, where Freud saw the Oedipus complex and all that, sort of sexual action going on, Erickson saw the conflict to be resolved as initiative versus guilt. Again, kind of along the same way, can I take initiative to do things? This, again, kind of growing sense of autonomy and individual action versus the kind of the guilt of sexual. Again, it's development. This is where Freud saw the superego developing, and Erickson sees that the issue of guilt as being a big one. Can I do things, or should I feel guilty when I do things, right? When I initiate action, and you develop this skill of purpose, or virtue of purpose, in the sense of having a purpose in life. Where Freud next again saw the latency stage, Erickson called it the school age. And again, it's another sort of version of this, where in this case, it's industry versus inferiority. And can you work hard, do things, get things done, or are you not able to? So this is when you're starting to compare yourself to other people. You've got school, gee, how well am I doing compared to other people? How well am I doing on the playground? Can I do these things? Am I competent, or am I not competent? So the sense of feelings of incompetence and inferiority would start to develop at that stage. And again, he moved on, and he had where Freud again kind of stops here at the genital stage. Erickson called this adolescence, and this was really this issue of identity becomes really front and center. Kind of, who am I? How can I be true to myself? And again, the fact that you guys picked that is perfect, because that's essentially the stage that you're at, right? Where identity and finding out who you are, how you fit in the world, and versus sort of not knowing or not feeling like you're doing the things that are actually right for you, right? And that's why he talked the skill that you develop at that stage is what he called fidelity, right? So when you're true to yourself, when you've sort of got this sense of, I know who I am, and I can be true to that person, versus, gee, I'm not really sure who I am. Is this who I should be? Is this what's right? Am I faking it in the sense when I'm doing something that doesn't fit with me? And this central issue of identity. Again, then where Freud saw everything ending, Erickson saw this struggle to develop an identity and to and these different skills going on through life. So in young adulthood, the issue that, the crisis that Erickson saw you had to resolve is this issue of intimacy versus isolation, right? So this is when people form their pair bonds, they get married, and gee, can I really connect with somebody in a deep way, or do I have intimacy issues? Can I really just can't commit? Can you connect with another person, get into that place where you're comfortable settling in with one person in particular, or are you going to isolate yourself in various ways? And again, what the skill he developed was love. So it's really a mature love, the ability to kind of give yourself to somebody else, connect with somebody else in this intimate way. Next, at the age of 30 to 65, is what he called adulthood, and the issue there is what he called generativity versus stagnation. So and this is the struggle of people my age. Where am I? Am I producing things? Am I giving things back? Am I developing this sense that I'm, again, this idea of generativity, of giving things back to the world, to the next generation? Am I maturing and kind of accomplishing the things that I want, or am I just sort of stagnant, not really growing and doing the things that I want to do with my life? The sense that people can just say, boy, look back on their lives when they get older, but boy, I just didn't really do anything and give anything, or do you have this sense of generativity, and that's this idea of care again. So, are you sort of spending less time worrying about you and your own career and more time helping other people, helping children develop and sort of caring about others? And finally, mature age. So at the end of life, he saw that again there was still another crisis that had to get dealt with, and that was this issue of integrity versus despair. So could you look back on your life and see that you lived a life of integrity, that had some meaning, that if you have resolved all these other stages well, right, then you're in a place where you can look back on your life and say, gee, everything fits together, I have some sense of integrity, or do I feel like, gee, I just, had one chance at life and I blew it, and what did I do this for, in the sense of despair. And again, the skill that you develop there is wisdom. So it's really an interesting theory. It's really commonsensical in a lot of ways, but underneath this, right, is the same veneer of psychoanalytic thought. So the same kind of notion that if you don't resolve whatever that crisis is at that point in life, well, then you kind of leave energy back behind, and you're still trying to work out earlier issues, and we're still trying to work out intimacy issues later in life where other people moved on. And so you can look at their psychological disorders and look at, gee, what are some crises that didn't get resolved well, and that's kind of the energy that you left back. So Freud had this really physical kind of metaphor about energy and fixation and all these things, and people just sort of pulled away from that, and they're gave a kind of more commonsensical view of that, right? This idea that you just get stuck in development sometimes, just don't manage those developmental scores well. So very influential idea, lots of work done. There's still Ericksonian institutes and places that really embody this full lifespan stage and this emphasis on identity. Any questions about any of those guys, Erickson or? All these are really influential ideas, and again, essentially adopting basic Freudian approach, but departing with him largely on these issues of what people are really striving for, and more of an emphasis on ego and conscious resolution of things, and less on these kind of unconscious instinctual gratification issues. So all of these people broke with Freud to a certain extent, but other people broke more fully from Freud. And again, he was the gorilla in the room, and so people really began to define their ideas about personality development in contrast to Freud. So either sort of adopting what he did or rejecting it. And so one way to characterize all this, Freud's view of human nature was essentially negative, right? selfish, pessimistic. So Freud saw people as ultimately these balls of id that you're just trying to get what you want all the time, right? And that can't happen. You just can't get what you want all the time. There's this conflict between just living in society and a culture, right, that just makes you need to delay gratification and not do the things that you want. And so not only are people sort of ultimately these kind of give me what I want, give me what I want, give me what I want, using people for things, but it's also impossible to get through life without a lot of psychopathology, right? Life is a minefield in that way to him. So again, if unrestrained by consequences in society, people would just pursue gratification, the psychopathologists inevitable. The humanistic psychologists really adopted a very different kind of approach, a much more positive approach. So their view of human nature is essentially positive, selfless, and optimistic. So if you want to know what sort of people are oriented toward, they're ultimately oriented in this way to move toward growth and development, to realize their potential, to connect with other people. That's our nature. So if left alone, that everything would kind of go good. Where Freud, in society, Freud saw, if these people are left alone, they do all these selfish things, and humanists essentially would say, if you're left alone, you can do these positive, connecting kind of things. And they developed this term that you probably hear a lot, the idea of self-actualization. And that's really the fundamental human drive toward self-actualization, kind of realizing your potential, connecting with other people in these positive sorts of ways. Right, so it's really a philosophical break where Freud was kind of this negative entity. Here's the crazy guy, his name's all about sex. We're these positive people. We really see people in a much more positive light. And there was became a whole movement of people who have developed theories that had these basic elements, this much more positive, optimistic take on development. I want to talk about two of the most famous of those and their ideas. One is a guy named Abraham Maslow, who developed his ideas, and the most famous of which is this hierarchy of needs. So again, he had this basic notion that Freud's right. And even the humanistic psychologists, I want to make sure to say this, basically embraced many of Freud's ideas about defense mechanisms and unconscious influences. He was very influential in that way, right? But what Maslow's basic idea was that people are striving toward this self-actualization. But they can't get there if they have other needs that are involved. There's this hierarchy of needs, basic sorts of things that have to get taken care of before you can move on and reach this point of self-actualization. So, and the idea is you can't meet the higher order needs unless you've resolved and dealt with the lower order needs. So at the bottom, and this is his sort of famous diagram of the hierarchy of needs. So at the first level, there's these biological, physiological things that Freud would have paid attention to as well, right? So you have the basic need to breathe and eat and drink and have sex and all these kinds of things. And if you can't get those things, it's really hard for you to focus on anything else, right? If you're not breathing, if I've got a pillow over your face, you're not really into self-actualization at that point, right? You got other things to deal with. And so to the extent that people are having trouble dealing with their basic needs, they're hungry, they're thirsty, they're poor, they can't get the basic things that they need, it's hard for them to develop into fully self-actualized people, right? But if you've got those physiological needs taken care of, well then the next set of needs above that is basic safety needs. Security from harm, having enough money to eat, drink, be comfortable. There you have this connection with family and some sort of moral community and these sort of things that once you get the physiological needs taken care of, you can move to these safety needs. And if you're worried about, gee, where's my paycheck coming? There's people out to get me. I'm not connected with people. I wish I had a wife or family connections. And those things are going to stop you. If you can't meet those needs, those will stop you from moving on. If you can meet those safety needs, the next kind of needs, these more social needs. So each one kind of moves up in this kind of abstract sense. So the needs for love and belonging, friendship, family, sexual intimacy. Again, it's hard to get those unless you're feeling safe and have your physiological needs met. If you have those love and belonging needs met, then you can move on to this basic need that people have for self-esteem, to try to feel good about themselves, to have confidence, achievement, feel like other people respect them. You can see the elements of like all these Neo-Freudian ideas in there too. That there's security needs and there's needs for feeling good about yourself, sort of superiority kind of needs, right? And if you can meet those, if you can feel good about yourself, then you can move on to this last stage where you can become kind of this fully self-actualized person, right? Which he saw as having a well-developed sense of morality and being creative, being able to solve problems, kind of being able to accept others for what they are, lack of prejudice, lack of disdain for other people, and acceptance of the world the way it is, which becomes a really crucial issue as well, so acceptance of facts. If you can kind of say, yeah, the world is not the perfect place it should be, I'm not the perfect person that I need to be, but that's okay, right? Because I'm working on doing things, right? So this basic idea of the fully self-actualized person is one that's able to kind of capture life in all of its riches and have these peak experiences, where you're really completely engaged in realizing your full potential. Right? But there really is another very, very influential idea, right? That you have to have these lower order needs met before you can develop into everything that you could be as a person. Right? And that's your natural tendency, right? So if these needs can be met, the natural tendency is to rise and become this self-actualized person, but sometimes that just doesn't work out as well as we would hope, right? There's things, roadblocks that can get in the way of all these different things, and you can, in a sense, you get energy sort of stuck back in those lower order needs, right? So you're trying to get food and just connect with people so you can never realize your full creative potential and all that. So really similar kind of notions, but again, with a more positive slant. Any questions about that? One more clicker question. The key aspect of mental health is that a person is, quote unquote, in touch with their feelings and recognizes their own weaknesses and shortcomings. Do you think that's true or false? Do you think it's really important to mental health to be able to sort of recognize, to be in touch with your feelings, what your real feelings are, right? Do you think that's important, or do you think that's just gooey, right? So is that true or false? It's an importance of mental health to be able to recognize your own shortcomings and weaknesses. Be in touch with your feelings. See what? Yes, it is. That's the end. You hear this all the time, right? So this is kind of, in many ways, what's funny about psychology, right, is it gets depicted lots of different ways. So I want to connect some of these sort of theories to media kind of influences, right? This is often the way you hear about psychology. You got to be in touch with your feelings and all this kind of stuff. And those ideas all come or are most perfectly embodied by the work of a guy named Carl Rogers. Now that's not Carl Rogers, right? That's Mr. Rogers. But they're really similar in a lot of ways. So there's a connection. You'll see this real overwhelming positivity that comes out of Carl Rogers. And there's some sense in which it was kind of reminiscent of Mr. Rogers as well. Another sort of good example, media example, I watched the Saturday Night Live special on Sunday, and made me think of it. They had a character that's way before your guys' time that you may or may not know about, named Stuart Smalley. Anybody know Stuart Smalley? Anybody know who played Stuart Smalley? What he does now? A guy named Al Franken, who's senator from Minnesota, and he was one of the original writers on Saturday Night Live. And this character was kind of a spoof on, this is his famous line, his little catchphrase from Saturday Night Live was Stuart Smalley doing his affirmations. Oops, wrong button. What is this?
I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
So he had this whole character that was kind of a clinical psychologist kind of guy who was helping people, and he said, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And that was this sort of flavor of Carl Rogers' theory, right? And what I want to do is talk about it a little bit in detail. It's not in your book at all, and because it's really interesting and really well-developed theory, I think, and it's been very influential. Again, he was born in Illinois to a very devout Christian family. He was a committed Christian his whole life. Had this kind of really positive kind of sense. He rejected many of the notions that Freud had. So Freud, in Freudian therapy in particular, and we're going to talk more about this, that the therapist is very directive and is dominant, and Freud talked about his patients. And Carl Rogers didn't like any of that terminology. He thought people should be making these decisions for themselves. He didn't like the concept of patient, so he called it's often referred to as client-centered therapy or even person-centered therapy, right? So referred to as people came to see him as his clients, not as patients. His theory, which we're going to go over, is referred to as the phenomenological theory. And it's because, remember we talked about the phenomenology when we talked about at the end of the social psychology section, this idea about experience, about perceiving. And so it's a central part of his theory is about how people construe the world, how they perceive the world, and sometimes they don't perceive it in the right way, and those have to be adjusted. The key, sort of at the broadest level, the key concepts in his work were self-actualization. Again, he saw, just like Maslow, that that's sort of the key goals. And people, if left alone, will move towards self-actualization. And that's a fully self-actualized person is what you want to be. And that's kind of the struggle to get there. And this idea of the self, right? So it's a real central notion. Again, it's very influential in psychology today, this idea that you have a set of beliefs about what you're like. Both what you're really like and what you want to be like, and that's kind of the central concept, is trying to have you develop a sense of self and a positive sense of self. Also, I'm up here, I don't know if you ever saw the Bob Newhart show, and Bob Newhart show is really old, very funny, if you ever want to get it on Netflix or something. And he was a Rogerian therapist, and he never always talked about his clients, and he was this kind of spoof of psychology where they never tell you what to do. So this idea about, well, what do I do, doctor? Well, what do you think, right? So that was kind of the how it gets spoofed sometimes. But again, underlying it was, and we'll talk more about his therapeutic approach in the next section of the class, but underlying it was this kind of really interesting theory. So the first, and let me just sort of play the theory out for you. So it started off with these two central concepts, the real self and the ideal self. So what you have is you have this conception of yourself and what you're really like, the beliefs and perceptions of what you're really like versus an ideal self, right? So your beliefs and perceptions about what you should be like, what you want to be like, what you're striving to be like, what you ideally would be like. Right, so your real self looks something like this. For me, with all my flaws and what I'm really like, and then my ideal self says, oh yeah, I want to be this brilliant scientist and a rock star like Bruce Springsteen and a perfect moral person like Gandhi and great athlete. And that's what I really, ideally I'd want to be those things, right? It's a little bit of a caricature. So, but because people have these more realistic senses, right? They have a real sense of what they're like and what they really want to be like, where they want to get in life. Right, and those are central. And how those two relate to each other, right, is this crucial aspect aspect of the theory. There's another key distinction that kind of relates to a certain, so again, the idea is that you're trying to get from your real self to your ideal self, and that's the process of self-actualization, right? So when you develop toward what you really want to be, the person that you really want to be, that's this process of self-actualization. And that's what we want to maximize, this idea of moving toward your ideal self, according to Freuds. There's a related distinction. Again, this is where the theory gets a little bit complicated. People get confused sometimes. So there's another sort of distinction that he talks about that relates to real and ideal self, and it's called the difference between phenomenal and organismic experience. Right? So your phenomenal experience is the experience that you have as you perceive it, as you would report it. Right? So how we say we feel, what we say we're like. And it's subjective and conscious. Right? And then he contrasted that with what he called organismic experience, which is how you really feel, what you really think about yourself. Kind of what you're really experiencing in your life. And it very often is this unconscious thing, or that's it has to be work bringing the conscience. So the sort of core example is something like what Rogers was interested in is somebody who would come in, let's say a young woman comes into the office and is talking about, she's obviously really upset. Her mother had just told her that she had to move home and she wanted her to break with her boyfriend, and she's gone. And he asked her, "So how are you feeling?" "I feel great. I love my mother." I love my mother. It's just like, my mother's great. I love my mother. Right? That's your phenomenal experience. That's what they're reporting. That's what they're trying to feel. Contrast that with their organismic experience, what they're really feeling. Right? It's like they're hating their mother. They're going, "I want to kill her. I want to strangle her. I'm really angry at her, and I hate this woman." Right? So that's the idea is that that's how you really, if we can really dig down to your soul, this is how you're really feeling. You're really upset with your mother, right? But you're unwilling to say that because you don't want to be upset with your mother. You love your mother. It makes you anxious and makes you feel bad when you admit that you're mad at her, something you don't want to do. And so there's this distinction. The phenomenal experience is what you're reporting, and the organismic experience is what you're really, really feeling. So it kind of, again, the real self is what you're really like, organismic experience is what you're sort of really feeling versus your ideal feelings, your ideal conceptions of self. Now this is when it gets a little more complicated though, right? So he's got this, there's the sort of central psychological state that he talks about is congruence versus incongruence. So when a person is in a congruent state is when their phenomenal and organismic experience agree. Right? So they're equal sign on here. It's when how you say you're feeling is really what you're feeling. You're in touch with your feelings. Yes, I'm feeling very upset with my mother right now. And I want to strangle her, and that makes me feel bad because I don't want to feel like I don't want to strangle my mother. Right? So you're able to say very much how you're really feeling. You're really in touch with that. Now, what that state, when you're in that congruent state, the funny thing is that it's an acknowledgement that your ideal self doesn't match with your real self. Right? You're saying, I don't want to feel like this. I don't want to hate my mother. Right? I don't want to not be able to talk to her and deal with things. Right? And so I wish, I really wish I could, right? But I can't. And so it's really crucial if you're in touch with your feelings that you're acknowledging that you're not everything you could be, right? That you're falling short of your goals. You're in touch with your feelings. You understand your weaknesses, right? So that's the state of congruence. And the whole notion is in order to achieve self-actualization, you have to be able to acknowledge that your ideal self and your real self aren't the same. Right? Because then you can't grow. If you say, I love my mother, it's great, right? She's great. I love my mother. You're never going to get it better, right? If you don't admit that you aren't in a place that you want to be, you can't move in that direction, right? So acknowledging your feelings, being in touch with your feelings, being in this congruent state is what's crucial to maintain this ability to self-actualize. And if you can't admit those, then you're kind of stuck. And that's what happens in the state of incongruence. So incongruence, again, is when your phenomenal and organismic experience disagree. Just like this example we keep working through. You can't admit how you're really feeling. You can't admit your own weaknesses and faults, right? So you're saying, so how you say you're feeling is the same. It's much better than how you're really feeling. And you're, in a sense, perceiving that your ideal self and real self are the same. Yeah, I'm great. I'm not the kind of person that hates my mother. I'm great. Everything's going good. Not a problem. Right? And that's what, that's when people have to use these defense mechanisms, some way of explaining, taking that, again, it's this sort of incongruence that you're not able to sort of accept your own feelings. It makes you have to deal, and Rogers was very much in line with Freud in this idea that what happens at that point is you use these kind of defense mechanisms, right? Project your feelings on other people. Oh, my mother hates me, or yeah, my sister really hates my mother. That's what it is, and I'm fine, or so all these ways to deal with that anxiety. All those things are the things that get in the way of self-actualization. So unless you can admit that your real self and ideal self are different, unless you can acknowledge your own feelings, you can't move towards self-actualization. So again, there's this kind of tricky aspect where organismic and phenomenal experience don't quite match up with ideal and real self in the kind of as a mechanistic in this way, right? So that's the basic gist of the theory. Well, what do you need to do to resolve these kinds of things? And again, we'll talk more about therapy next time, but it's kind of his other really central concept is this idea of what we call positive regard. That very often what causes these problems, right, is this inability to like and love yourself. So positive regard is simply liking or loving, respecting another person. And he talked about two different kinds. These again, this is seeped into the popular culture as well. The difference between what we call unconditional positive regard and conditional positive regard. So unconditional positive regard means it's not dependent on somebody's behavior. It's not conditional on what you do. So if your parents are giving you unconditional positive regard, that's this idea of saying, I love you no matter what. Doesn't matter what you do, the choices you make, I'm going to love you no matter what. This idea of unconditional positive regard, as opposed to conditional positive regard when it's dependent on your behavior. When you get the sense that some parents, right, would tend to withdraw love when you're not doing the things that they want you to do. Right? Gee, hi mom, I'm gay, and they pull away, right? Or choosing a different career, or just acting at the times when everybody screws up, when you screwed up, if you get the sense that your parents are pulling away from you, right? That's this idea of conditional positive regard. And that is the real problem, right? So the way you get into this incongruent state is through the central sort of problem in human existence is this idea of conditional positive regard. Because what happens essentially is that if you get unconditional positive regard from others, then what you do is internalize that positive regard, and it has to do with your positive self-regard, right? And then you develop a sense that people whose parents give them this unconditional positive regard treat themselves the same way. They don't withdraw love from themselves when they don't live up to their own standards, right? So that they'll accept their own weaknesses, the fact that their real self doesn't match up with their ideal self, right? They can achieve the sense of congruence, saying, yeah, I still love me even though I'm not perfect and I'm not always feeling the way I should feel, right? And so if you get those, and that's how you get into the state of congruence and then ultimately to the state, right, of self-actualization. As opposed to the other kind of path, you get conditional self-regard from others, from your parents, therefore you treat yourself the same way. You feel bad about yourself when you don't live up to your own standards, right? So you withdraw love from yourself, so you can't admit that you're phenomenal organismic, how you're really feeling, right? You can't admit that you're not everything you should be, that you're ideal and real self aren't the same, and so you develop this kind of tendency to become incongruent. And then that's what blocks up self-actualization, leads to these defense mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. And then when we get to the point of therapy, so the whole idea of therapy flows directly from this, which is essentially the core sort of goal of therapy is to give the client the sense of unconditional positive regard, right? That you're acceptable, you're good no matter what you do. So it's all this nice positive stuff, right? So it has this really positive tone to it, that people are working toward self-actualization, as long as they kind of get unconditional positive regard from people and the way people should act, and everything will develop and people will flourish in these self-actualized beings. But that the problem is occasionally some people get this kind of this conditional positive regard, develop this internal conditional positive self-regard, and then can't self-actualize. And so what they need is unconditional positive regard to fix it. Any questions about the theory? Go ahead. Yes. Oh, yeah. So when you can't accept how you really feel, right, that usually leads to this kind of incongruent state. But the trick is that that makes your real and ideal self kind of the same. But the incongruence happens at this level of organismic experience. So there's one last question. So let's ask one last one here. If you had to vote, which you do, because I'm making you, which theoretical perspective do you think is a better description of human personality functioning? Are you on team psychoanalysis or are you team humanism? So which do you think is really a better, more accurate characterization of human functioning? If you had to choose. Or neither. So if you think they both suck, you can write neither. 3, 2, 1. Oh, sneak them in at the end there. So people like humanistic psychology, right? So they think that's a better description. Interesting. Right? Because that's kind of the more modern version and that's the more positive version. Let me just do a little bit of comparison here at the end again just to kind of drive home these points. So there's real similarities and differences between humanistic psychology and psychoanalytic perspective. So first, the difference is, right, this negative versus positive view of human nature. We get an emphasis on where psychoanalysis has an emphasis on the id and instinct versus an emphasis on the ego, social needs, relationships, is more conscious, more kind of commonsensical sorts of things about your social relationships. Again, in Freudian theory, psychopathology is very likely. In humanistic theory, the idea is it's less likely. So your natural tendency is to self-actualize and connect to all these things, and the sort of exception is psychopathology. Where in the Freudian world, really, psychopathology is sort of the rule, in a sense. Nobody gets out unscathed. And again, the therapies have a very different approach. We'll talk more about that idea, again, in the next part of the class. But they also have some key similarities. So they're both really comprehensive theories. So they say, look, here's, if you really want to understand personality functioning all the way through to personality problems and the development of psychopathology, you just got to go to my theory. So Freud's theory is particularly comprehensive. So Freudian theory is really a theory not just of normal personality functioning, of abnormal personality functioning. Later on, it really became a theory of religion, a theory of society and culture, and Freud thought he could explain everything. Rogers thought he could explain all psychopathology. This is his version of all psychopathology comes from his theory. So they're both comprehensive. they both posit these fundamental motivations, right? So they're getting the sense of, yeah, here's the core thing that drives people. Right, so they both had that, they had different ones, right? Instinctual gratification versus self-actualization, those things, but again, the same idea. They both emphasize unconscious conflict, the use of defense mechanisms, so those humanistic theories really adopted Freud's ideas about that. The therapies were similar in style in the sense that they took a long time. They were talking therapies, right? So the idea of, Freudian therapy, people will be in for years. Rogerian therapy, people are in for years. So this idea that you really need this, and neither is really based on very much data. So these guys were clinicians. They were seeing patients and developing theories kind of intuitively based on what they saw. Now they talk a lot about that being trying to be really objective, and Freud thought of his patients as data, right? But it isn't data in any sense that sort of we understand, right? And I want to do, so they have differences, but they also have similarities, and I want to again contrast those to where we're going to go next time, just really briefly, right? So these class views like psychoanalysis and humanism, and the humanistic approach really emerged from clinical work with patients. They're these broad explanatory theories, they're historical, and they're dynamic, right? So they want to know where, when they talk about your personality, they're talking about it's developing through history and through your development. And if you want to know what you're like now, I need to understand that by figuring out what you happen to you later on, right? And these kind of dynamic forces. Where what we're really going to talk about, modern psychology really doesn't adopt that kind of approach at all. So contemporary work, and where I want to give you a quick whirlwind tour through next time, and things like the trait approach and social cognitive approach, came from a very different place. So these things emerged not from clinical, working with patients. They emerged from scientific data, from experiments, and a variety of other kinds of, some of them are heavily statistical in the way they approach things. They're much more focused on specifics. So these aren't, what we're going to be talking about next time, aren't theories of everything. Sometimes they don't even sound like theories, they feel like theories, right? Just more descriptive, but so they tend to be much more specific, trying to say, I can explain this part of personality functioning, or I can explain this part of personality functioning, as opposed to I can explain everything. Right, so much more focused and specific. And they tend to be ahistorical, descriptive, and predictive. So in other words, they tend to very often say, well, I'm just going to be able to measure what you're like now, and then we'll figure out, and then I'll be able to characterize you so I can describe people, what different kinds of people are like. Well, how did they get that way? Well, I don't know. Right there, that's not really what the modern approaches are so interested in, how you got that way, but what you're like now, what are the different kinds of people, and how those people behave. They're going to be ahistorical, descriptive, and predictive. The idea if I can measure something about you, then I can predict how you're going to behave. I can predict what kind of trouble you're in. Okay, so they have a very different orientation, right? In one case, kind of coming from a clinical background, in the other case, really coming from this more scientific sort of approach, right? And so, next time we're going to talk about these again, more modern approaches and try and get through as many of them as we can. Next time, any questions about any of this stuff? Then I'm done. We're out of here. See you guys on Thursday.